It was a Wednesday afternoon in late October, and I was at the kitchen table going through a stack of mail when my granddaughter walked in from school. She was 8 years old, still wearing her backpack, her winter coat half unzipped. She set her lunch bag on the counter the way she always did, then stood there for a moment, not saying anything. That was unusual for her. She was normally chatty the second she came through the door. "Nana," she said finally in a voice that was quieter than normal, "can I ask you something?" "Of course, sweetheart." She looked down at her boots. "Can I stop taking the vitamins that Daddy's friend gives me? They make me feel weird." The envelope I'd been holding slipped out of my hands onto the table. "I want to be clear about something." My daughter and her husband had gone to South Korea on a 14-month work contract with his engineering firm. They'd left in August. The plan was that their daughter, my granddaughter Rosie, would live with me in Oakville for the school year, rather than disrupt her education midterm. It had seemed like a sensible arrangement. I'd raised 2 children, spent 22 years as a registered nurse at Halton Healthcare before retiring, and Rosie and I had always been close. I had a spare bedroom, a good school nearby, and more time than I knew what to do with. My husband Gerald had passed 4 years earlier from a sudden cardiac event, and the house had felt too quiet ever since. So Rosie had moved in with me in August, and by September, she had started grade 3 at the school 3 blocks away, and everything had been fine. Or so I thought. "What vitamins, Rosie?" She twisted the zipper pull on her coat. "The ones Ryan brings. He says they're from Daddy, to help me grow strong because Daddy feels bad he can't be here." I kept my voice very steady. "Who is Ryan?" "Daddy's friend. He lives in the house behind the fence." She meant the semi-detached behind our property. There was a cedar hedge separating the 2 backyards. The unit had been rented out since spring. I'd seen the tenant a handful of times. A man in his mid-30s, dark hair, drove a silver pickup. He'd waved to me once over the hedge in September and introduced himself. Ryan Calloway. Said he worked in logistics. I'd thought nothing of it. "When does Ryan give you these vitamins?" Rosie bit her lip. "On days when you go to your knitting group. He knocks on the back door and I let him in, and he gives me the vitamin and a glass of water and we watch a little bit of TV. He says Daddy texted him and asked him to check on me. And he says I shouldn't tell you because you'll worry, and Daddy doesn't want you to worry." The back of my neck went cold. I'd been a nurse for over 2 decades. I knew what it looked like when an adult used the language of care to build secrecy around a child. I knew exactly what that pattern was. "Rosie, where are the vitamins now?" "In my room." "In the little pouch in my backpack." "Not this backpack, the purple one in the closet. Go get it for me, please, and then I need you to sit at the kitchen table and do your reading while I make a phone call. Okay?" She nodded and went upstairs. I stood at the counter and pressed my hands flat on the cold granite and breathed. Gerald used to say I went very still when something was wrong, like a thermostat clicking off. That's what I did then. I went still. Rosie came back with a small purple drawstring bag. Inside was a white plastic container, the kind you could buy at any dollar store. No label, no pharmacy markings, no Health Canada certification sticker, just a piece of masking tape across the lid with Rosie 1 per day written in blue pen. I shook one out into my palm. Small, oval, pale yellow, no imprint. "How long has Ryan been giving you these?" She thought about it. "Since after Thanksgiving, I think. Maybe a little before." That was 6 weeks. 6 weeks. "And after you take one, how do you feel?" Kind of tired, actually. Ryan says that means they're working, so I usually fall asleep on the couch, and when I wake up, he's gone. I put the pill back in the container. I'd put the container in a Ziploc bag from the kitchen drawer. Then I called my friend Beverly. Beverly and I have known each other since our nursing days at Halton. She had crossed over into clinical pharmacy about 15 years ago and still consulted part-time for a couple of family practices in Burlington. She was the most methodical person I had ever known. "Bev," I said, "I need you to look at something today. Can I come to you?" She heard something in my voice. "Come now." I told Rosie I had to run a quick errand and that our neighbor Helen, a retired teacher who Rosie adored, would sit with her for an hour. Helen was at our door in 7 minutes. I drove to Burlington with the Ziploc bag on the passenger seat and my hands tighter on the wheel than they needed to be. Beverly met me at her front door. She took one look at the bag and brought me inside without a word. At her kitchen island, she opened the container, examined the pills under the light above the stove, broke one in half and studied the cross-section with a small magnifying glass she kept in a kitchen junk drawer along with reading glasses and takeout menus, the way people do. "These aren't vitamins," she said. I heard myself say, "Are you sure?" It wasn't even a question. It came out flat. "I'm not the lab," she said, "but I can tell you with a high degree of confidence that this is a sedative. The color, the shape, the way it scores. This is consistent with a low to moderate dose benzodiazepine or a Z drug, the kind used for sleep. It is not a children's supplement. These are not over the counter. Someone with a prescription or access to pharmaceuticals got these." I told her everything. About Ryan Calloway, about the backdoor visits, about my daughter being overseas, about the instruction to keep secrets. Beverly put both hands on the counter and looked at me very levelly. "You need to call the police, tonight, and you need to call your daughter." The drive home took 12 minutes. It felt much longer. I had time on that drive to think about whether my son-in-law had really asked this man to look after Rosie. I didn't want to believe it. He had always seemed like a decent father. But I also knew that people compartmentalized things, that marriages had pressures, that 14 months abroad could do strange things to a person. I didn't know what I would find. When I got home, Helen had Rosie at the kitchen table with a puzzle. I thanked Helen and took Rosie upstairs for her bath and bedtime, kept everything entirely normal, read her 2 chapters of her book, kissed her forehead, waited until she was asleep. Then I went to the kitchen and called my daughter on WhatsApp. She answered on the second ring, her face tired and warm on the small screen, Soul behind her. "Mom, what's wrong?" I told her about the vitamins. I told her who had given them to Rosie. I asked her point blank if her husband had arranged for Ryan Calloway to check on Rosie. The look on her face answered before she said a word. She put the phone down. I heard her voice in another room, low and sharp, her husband's voice answering, then silence. She came back. Her eyes were red. "He doesn't know anyone named Ryan Calloway, Mum. He's never given anyone our address. He's never asked anyone to look in on Rosie." My stomach dropped right through the floor. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a few minutes. Then I did something I had not done in the 4 years since Gerald died. I went through the house systematically. I walked through every room with fresh eyes and tried to notice what was missing. Gerald's father's cufflinks, a pair of heavy gold ones that had sat in a dish on my dresser for 30 years. Gone. A small group of 7 print, original, that had hung in the upstairs hallway. Gone. I'd walked past that empty rectangle on the wall for how long? I hadn't even noticed. 2 silver candlestick holders that had been a wedding gift. Gone. A vintage Inuit stone carving, a small bear, that Gerald had bought on a trip to Iqaluit before we were married. Gone. I stood in the living room with my arms crossed and felt a very specific kind of cold. I called the Halton Regional Police non-emergency line. I explained the situation to the officer who answered, and within 20 minutes a constable was at my door. Within an hour of that, I was at the station making a formal statement, the Ziploc bag in an evidence envelope, photographs on my phone of every place where something had gone missing. Rosie's testimony typed up in a children's disclosure format with the help of a family violence officer named Constable Tremblay, who was calm and thorough and excellent with children. The detective assigned to investigate was a woman named Detective Sandra Okafor. She was direct and unhurried, the way good investigators are, and she took notes in a small notebook while I talked. "Mrs. Hendricks," she said. "That is my name, Barbara Hendricks. Based on what you've described, we're looking at administering a noxious substance to a minor, breaking and entering, theft over $5,000, and potentially criminal harassment. We can move on the neighbor's unit, but I'd like to discuss something with you first." What she proposed was this. The following Wednesday was my knitting group day. The day Ryan Calloway normally came. She wanted me to go as usual. She wanted Rosie, with my full informed consent and with Rosie's own agreement, which the constable would discuss with her separately, gently, age-appropriately, to wear a small recording device. There would be an unmarked car on the street. The moment he entered the house and produced any substance, they would move. I looked at Detective Okafor and thought about whether I could ask an 8-year-old to do that. I called Rosie downstairs. Constable Tremblay sat with her at the kitchen table for 20 minutes. I stayed in the doorway. Tremblay explained it in terms Rosie could understand, that a grown-up had been doing something that wasn't allowed, and that if Rosie was willing, she could help make sure he couldn't do it to any other kids. Rosie was quiet for a moment. "Will he get in trouble?" "Yes," Constable Tremblay said. "Good," said Rosie. "I never liked those vitamins anyway." The week between that conversation and the following Wednesday was the longest of my life. I went through the motions. I made school lunches. I helped Rosie with her multiplication tables. I video called my daughter every evening so she could see Rosie was fine. My daughter wanted to come home immediately. I told her to wait 1 week. Just 1 week. I called my lawyer, a woman named Deborah Park, who had done my estate planning after Gerald died. I told her what was happening. She began preparing documentation. The lab report came back on Monday. Detective Okafor called me at 9 in the morning. "Mrs. Hendricks, the pills are Zopiclone. That's a prescription sleep medication, what we sometimes call a Z-drug. A single dose of the concentration found in these pills would be sufficient to sedate a child of Rosie's weight for 3 to 4 hours. With repeated use over 6 weeks, there is potential for dependence, liver impact, and disruption to normal sleep development. We have the report. We also have Ryan Calloway's background. She told me his real name was Ryan Pellerin. He had a record in 2 provinces, British Columbia and Alberta, for fraud, theft over, and break and enter. He had never worked in logistics. He had, according to digital records recovered with a warrant, researched the neighborhood specifically, looking for households with absentee parents or single elderly residents. He had identified our address through a community Facebook group where my daughter had posted about moving overseas. He had rented the unit behind our property in April and spent months establishing proximity before my granddaughter arrived. He had sold, through online marketplaces, items traced to at least 3 other homes in the area. The total value of what he had taken from my home alone was later assessed at just over $42,000, once the print was appraised. Wednesday came. I drove to my knitting group at the community center on Kerr Street at the usual time. I sat with my friends and tried to hold a conversation about a pattern for baby booties, while my phone sat face up on the table beside my coffee cup. At 3:52, it rang. "We have him," Detective Okafor said. "Come home." There were 2 Halton Regional Police cruisers in front of the house and an unmarked car at the curb. Ryan Pellerin was being walked to one of the cruisers as I pulled into the driveway. He didn't look like a predator. He looked like an ordinary man in a gray jacket, and that made it worse somehow. Rosie was on the front porch with Constable Tremblay, wrapped in her coat, holding a juice box with both hands. I walked past the police cars without looking at him. "Nana." She held up the juice box. They gave me apple juice. I see that, sweetheart. I sat down beside her on the porch step and pulled her close. She leaned into my shoulder the way she had since she was a toddler. You were very brave. Tremblay said so too. She's right. Detective Okafor came over and told me that Rosie had been perfect. He had let himself in through the back gate. We found later that he had a copy of the key my daughter had left with a neighbor 2 years before. Given Rosie the pill, told her to lie down. They had moved in when Rosie took the glass of water from his hand. He was charged with administering a noxious substance to a minor, theft over $5,000, break-and-enter fraud, and child endangerment. With the prior record and the evidence across multiple incidents, his lawyer advised a guilty plea. He was sentenced to 8 years. My daughter and her husband flew home from Seoul the following week. The company was understanding. There was some rearrangement of the contract, some working remotely. They were back in their house in Mississauga within the month, and Rosie moved back with them for the second half of the school year. The night she moved out, she hugged me in the front hallway for a long time without saying anything. You can still call me every day, I told her. I know, she said. I threw myself into something I've been thinking about for a while. A child safety workshop through my local community health center, specifically about medication safety, and about teaching children the difference between appropriate adult behavior and behavior that should always be told to a trusted adult. I partnered with the school board on a unit about secrets versus surprises. It grew from 1 session to 4 and then to a regular program running in 6 schools across Halton. Detective Okafor came and spoke to one of the sessions. Afterward, she told me that cases like this one, where a child trusted a grandparent enough to speak up, were far less common than they should be. The ones who don't speak up, she said, are usually the ones who were told it was a secret to protect someone they love. She paused. Your granddaughter knew that telling you would help, not hurt. That's not an accident. That's how you raised her mother. I thought about that for a long time. About 2 years after everything, I was at a volunteer dinner at the community center, and I was seated next to a man named Howard Ellsworth, who had just retired from teaching high school history. He was soft-spoken and had a dry sense of humor and was very interested in the community garden project being proposed for the empty lot on Trafalgar. We talked for 3 hours. It was the first evening in a long time that I had talked to someone without looking at my phone. We met for coffee the following week, and then the week after that. The first time Rosie met him, she shook his hand very formally and said, "Are you Nana's friend?" "I hope so," Howard said. She steadied him with the particular seriousness of a 9-year-old. "Okay. Do you like dogs? We're getting a dog." They became co-conspirators about the dog almost immediately. Howard had had a beagle growing up and gave Rosie an extensive briefing on the case for beagles versus golden retrievers that lasted 2 car trips. They eventually settled on a golden retriever named Biscuit, who became Howard's shadow from the moment he moved into the house on a gray Thursday in March. Howard turned Gerald's old study into a proper reading nook for Rosie. Put in a second set of bookshelves and a beanbag chair she had picked out herself. She spent most of her Saturday visits there with Biscuit across her feet, reading whatever she happened to be reading that week, which was, increasingly, true crime and courtroom drama. "She's going to be a Crown attorney," Howard said one evening, watching her through the study doorway. "Or a detective," I said. "Or both," he said. We married 18 months after the volunteer dinner. It was November, and we had the reception at the Burlington Golf and Country Club because Howard's daughter had connections, and Rosie was the flower girl and took the job extremely seriously, scattering petals in a very deliberate pattern that she had apparently planned in advance and diagrammed on a piece of graph paper at home. We found out about the diagram afterward. That was very Rosie. She's 11 now. She wants to study law. She won her school's public speaking competition in the spring with a talk about the importance of teaching children to recognize manipulation by adults. Afterward, her teacher sent me a photograph of Rosie at the podium. I have it on the fridge. Sometimes I still think about that Wednesday in October when she came through the door and stood there in her winter coat, not saying anything, trying to figure out how to say something that felt complicated and frightening. She was 8 years old, and she had been carrying it, and then she set her lunch bag down and she decided to trust me. Everything that happened after, everything, started with that. She asked me once, when she was about 10, whether I was angry at Ryan Pellerin. I thought about it honestly before answering. I was, I said. For a while I was very angry, but I don't think about him much anymore. I think about you. She nodded, apparently satisfied with that answer. Good, she said. He's not worth thinking about. She's right, of course. She usually is. I still think about the moment Rosie stood in the kitchen doorway in her winter coat, trying to find the words. She was 8 years old. She'd been carrying something frightening for weeks, and she chose to put it down in front of me. That choice, that small, quiet act of trusting someone, is what I keep coming back to even now. What happened to us didn't happen because we were unlucky. It happened because someone made deliberate choices to deceive, and then other people made deliberate choices to act with integrity when it mattered. Those two things ran on parallel tracks through the whole story, and in the end, it was pretty clear which one held. Ryan Pellerin didn't stumble into our lives by accident. He calculated. He researched. He identified a household where a child would be present without her parents, found a way to build proximity, and then used the language of care. Vitamins, health, something Daddy arranged to build a wall of secrecy around what he was doing. That kind of manipulation is sophisticated. It is designed specifically to exploit the trust a child has for the adults in her life. And it almost worked. What stopped it was not a security system or a locked door. What stopped it was Rosie's own moral instinct that something was wrong, and her decision to say so out loud to someone she trusted. I think about that a lot. We talk so much about protecting children from the outside, and we do far too little work building the inner compass that lets them protect themselves. Rosie knew something was off. She felt it in her body. The tiredness, the secrecy, the instruction not to tell. She didn't have the vocabulary to name it, but she had enough of a foundation to bring it to me rather than bury it. That foundation didn't come from nowhere. It came from years of being told her feelings were worth paying attention to, that the adults in her life were safe to talk to, that keeping secrets to protect someone else's comfort was not her job. Beverly's role in all of it reminds me that knowing things, actually understanding how the world works, knowing what a pill is supposed to look like and what it means when it doesn't, is not a small matter. I was a nurse for 22 years. Beverly was a pharmacist. That knowledge, applied carefully and without panic, is what turned a frightening moment into a documented case. Intelligence isn't just what you retain from school. It's what you do with what you know when someone needs you to be clear-headed. It's the discipline to not assume, to verify, to act on evidence rather than hope. And then there is the matter of continuing on. The months after everything, the legal process, Rosie's nightmares, the gaps on the walls where things used to hang, those asked something of me that I hadn't been asked in a while. To keep going without Gerald, to run a household and protect a child, and still show up for my knitting group and my volunteer work and not become someone defined by what had been taken from me. That kind of steadiness is not dramatic. It doesn't look like much from the outside, but it is, I think, the most honest form of strength there is. Rosie is 11 now, and she will be fine. I know this, the way I know certain things. Not because everything has been easy, but because she has already shown me who she is. She stood on a stage in front of her school and talked about manipulation and trust and speaking up, and the teacher sent me a photograph and I put it on the fridge. That's what I keep.